The zip drive launched in March 1995. Iomega's revenue exploded over the next 2 years. The stock moved so erratically that this phenomenon had its own nickname, Iomega. 3 years later, the CEO had resigned. A class action claimed 28 million users had been victims, and the drives were still making that sound. This is a story of how a simple storage cartridge taught its maker what trust was worth. The clicking was the sound of a read-write head reacting and reinserting itself because it could no longer find the servo pattern, the factory-written track map that told it where on the disk it was. The drive was destroying the disk and sometimes the next one too. For most of the early 1990s, the standard portable container for computer files was the famous 1.44 megabyte floppy disk. Home hard drives at the time only held a few hundred megabytes, and dial-up modems moved data so slowly that transferring a 10 megabyte file could take most of an evening. At the same time, files were expanding. Desktop publishing projects and things like Quark Express, layered Photoshop images, early digital audio sessions, or engineering drawings routinely overflowed what a floppy could hold. Moving a magazine layout between a design studio and a print bureau often meant splitting files across a stack of labeled discs carried in a plastic case. There were alternatives, sure, but each carried its own kind of friction. CD burners in the mid-1990s cost close to $1,000 for a full system, and burning a disk still felt like an event. External hard drives were expensive and felt permanent, and network transfers required infrastructure most home users didn't have. What the market lacked was a cartridge that behaved like a floppy and held enough storage to be more useful. Iomega had been trying to solve exactly that problem since 1980. Its earlier product, the Bernoulli box, used an interesting airflow design to hold a flexible disk a micron below its read-write head, which made head crashes nearly impossible, but kept the price high. The company struggled through most of the 1980s and appointed a new chief executive named Kim Edwards in January 1994. Edwards believed the engineering was strong and the marketing was invisible. So he launched the zip drive in March 1995 at $199, with a 100 megabyte cartridge priced under $20. Revenue climbed from $141 million in 1993 to $1.74 billion in 1997. Iomega stock became one of the first to be driven by online retail investors. On the Motley Fool, an AOL message board for amateur traders, they gave the frenzy a name, Iomega. Inside the blue cartridge was a hybrid between a floppy disk and a hard drive. The platter was a flexible mylar disk, similar to the floppy, while the head flying above it was borrowed from the Winchester hard drive design. The sealed high-capacity platters inside every desktop was guided by a voice coil actuator, the same kind of arm mechanism that moves a hard drive's head. That head flew at a fraction of a micron above the surface, locked onto an embedded servo pattern that allowed for thousands of tracks, compared to a floppy disk that only held 80. The disk and the drive depended on each other in ways the floppy never had. The cartridge carried its own factory-written formatting and proprietary internal maintenance tracks. This effectively meant that if either side of the contract broke, the other became unreadable. The cartridge quickly settled into a specific role in daily life. Even though few users actually understood how it worked, school computer labs kept stacks of them near the monitors, labeled with students' names. Graphic designers carried them between studios and service bureaus. Office workers saved quarterly spreadsheets onto them and slid the disk into filing cabinets alongside paper records. Photographers copied scanned negatives, writers rotated weekday backups with a monthly archive disk set aside in a drawer. It worked for almost everyone, and by early 1998, more than half the removable storage market belonged to the zip drive. But something quieter happened underneath this Iomega mania. The first disc held a transfer and the second held a backup. The third held the only copy of something that mattered. The cartridge was always the same, but if the conditions were just right, or better said, wrong, the relationship changed and a tool for moving files had been prompted by the ordinary habits of its users into a vault. The click had a mechanism. A drive that had worked for months would begin to retry every time the disk was inserted, repeating the reaction rhythm as the head failed to find its servo reference. By January 30th, 1998, the symptom had spread far enough for Paul Festa to write it up by name in CNET. What made the reputation harder to contain was that the failure sometimes traveled. A malfunctioning drive could damage the next disk it touched. 2 months after the CNET article, on March 25, 1998, Kim Edwards, the chief executive who had launched the zip drive, resigned. In March 1999, Ted Briscoe, president of Iomega's personal storage division, told Maximum PC that the heads inside the zip drives were detaching from the actuator assembly when they stuck the crash stop, the hard limit at the end of the head's travel, too hard on load. A later revision added a slower ramp the company called Soft Park. The more catastrophic version of the failure was the rarer one, but it traveled across disks. When a head was ripped from its mounting while the mylar was still spinning at 2,941 RPMs, it could slice the edge of the disk, and now that damaged cartridge, if inserted into the next working drive, could snag and tear the heads of that drive in turn. Contagion, one biotech lab in Rockville, Maryland, reportedly lost 3 zip drives to one contaminated cartridge this way. The more common path was quieter and accounted for most of the reports. A malfunctioning drive silently miswrote a disk, and the damaged disk failed in every drive that tried to read it afterward. Iomega began including yellow caution stickers with replacement drives, warning customers not to reuse the original cartridge. Most computer failures don't have such a loud symptom, but the click of death played through the plastic casing of the drive, audible and rhythmic, while a person waited, fearing for the precious data inside. A jammed printer inconveniences, a failing keyboard disappoints, an unreadable storage format ruins trust in every disk already written and every disk not yet used. Steve Gibson, a software engineer who had written a hard drive diagnostic tool called SpinRite, released a free Windows utility named Trouble in Paradise that reported hidden drive status. Iomega's own interface never surfaced, consumed spare sectors, headseek errors, unrecoverable read failures, accumulating in the background while the drive still reported itself healthy. Gibson even appeared on the ZD TV program The Screensavers, and Iomega's aftermarket manager, David Hellier, phoned in live and promised replacement drives for affected customers in or out of warranty.
The purpose for me being on the call is to make sure our customers know that if they have any issue at all, if they feel like they have a problem that could be associated with the heads of the drive, we'd really ask our customers to go to Iomega's support line, and if they have any questions or concerns, we are more than happy to address them. In fact, we want them to go directly to us and not to third-party websites.
However, the company continued to state that fewer than 1 in 200 drives were affected. Gibson's reply, posted on his company website, was that Iomega's policy of denial had fueled the fire, and it made sense. On September 10, 1998, a class action lawsuit named Rinaldi vs. Iomega was filed. Class counsel estimated the class could include more than 28 million zip buyers. That December, in a separate matter concerning rebate fulfillment, the Federal Trade Commission imposed a $900,000 civil penalty, parallel evidence that the company's reputation was weakening on more than one front. The class action settlement approved in June 2001 offered consumers rebates of $5 to $40. But redeemable only on future Iomega products, and they never delivered any admission of liability. Once the backup format stopped feeling safe, alternatives that had once felt awkward began to feel obvious. CDR burners fell below $100, and blank disks cost cents a piece on a spindle. Internal hard drives crossed 10 gigabytes at consumer prices. In December 2000, the first USB flash drives reached American stores at 8 megabytes, with no moving parts and no clicking head. Home broadband replaced dial-up for file transfer. It was too late when the Zip 750 launched in August 2002. In April 2008, EMC acquired Iomega for roughly $213 million, a small fraction of the $7 billion market capitalization the company had briefly reached during the Iomega mania bubble. Ultimately, the Iomega brand was dissolved in 2018. Most technologies fade quietly, but this one announced its own death and took an entire category with it. The term "the failure left behind," click of death, outlived everything else. The lesson migrated upward into every modern backup habit that came after. The cartridges themselves still surface today, where archivists in recovery labs and hobbyists at home hope the next drive does not kill the next disk.